Welcome to the HC Commodities podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're joined by Doomberg, the most popular energy and commodity-focused Substack. Him and his team publish over 90 articles a year on the intersection of global energy and commodity policy, geopolitics, risk, and technology. Today is Doomberg Unleashed. How close are we to World War III? Are we already in it? What does that mean for the energy and commodity supply chains? How sanctions and tariffs not only reshape global commodity flows, but also weaken the West? And what the one big beautiful bill means for American industry and the energy transition, and much more. Always a challenging and fascinating discussion. And if you don't agree with him, I invite listeners to join their Substack and unpick the facts and analysis below their conclusions. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Doomberg, welcome back to the show.
Paul, great to be with you. Always enjoy our conversations.
Yeah, and steel helmets on for those of a squeamish nature. But I saw this very much as sort of Doomberg Unleashed, and I'm a follower of your Substack and your writings and thoughts, and really have sort of wanted to pick out a few of the key topics that have obviously been top of your mind and team's mind so far this year, and it's there's obviously not been lack of topics to cover. Just to start off. You obviously have been doing a lot of thinking about the unthinkable, which is, World War III or a growing global conflict, and what, where we are, whether we're in the foothills of that, which many commentators say we are. This is sort of, 1937 when Japan invaded China, and now seen as the start of World War II, if you'd like. But what the energy consequences of that are, and whether people are really doing enough thinking and acting about potentially mitigating what could now be an untold disaster.
Yeah, obviously we spent a lot of time thinking about that. We live in an interesting time, Paul. Never has more raw data been available to the curious analyst. And at the same time, never has been the proactive propaganda so thick. And we pride ourselves on being analysts and not advocates. And I think there's a significant intellectual difference between them. Many advocates are unaware that they are acting as advocates and are therefore quite susceptible to propaganda, which is a whole other subject. But I start my answer about our analysis of war because no geopolitical event brings out more emotions and more propaganda than war. And that makes the job of the analysts difficult. And then, as you say, steel hats on, we've come to certain conclusions based on our own independent analysis that can be jarring to people who get their news from The Economist or the Financial Times or the Washington Post exclusively because they have day jobs and they're not online 24 hours a day like we are, cranking out 90 articles a year. And another thing that we do that I think is pretty rare, but I wish wasn't, is that we also read the propaganda of all the sides. I think you have a far better chance of getting close to an objective truth if you read everything. And so we will read Ukrainian propaganda, we'll read Russian propaganda, we'll read what the Israelis are telling themselves, what the Iranians are telling themselves, what the Chinese are telling themselves. And over time, you develop certain sources and you grade them on their credibility on various subjects, and then you read the room. And so we also pride ourselves on thinking axiomatically. We start with a fundamental assumption and then model, assuming that opening axiom is true, regardless of whether we understand why that axiom is true. And that's sort of a classic form of lateral thinking, which is one of the things that we specialize in. And lateral thinking allows you to come up with interesting conclusions, perhaps more quickly. And so that's sort of a long preamble to what I'm about to say, which is that if you read the propaganda of the rest of the world, especially Russian, Chinese, Iranian, global South propaganda, the rest of the world already assumes we're in World War III. That it is a battle between the sort of collective West, the Atlanticist crowd, and the BRICS countries. And the core battle going on between those two factions is over, the US dollar supremacy and the desire on the part of the rest of the world to escape the US dollar system, or at least the way in which the US dollar system has been weaponized against the global South. And so through that context, then, the last 10 years make a lot of sense. And so the war in Iran, of course, BRICS country, the key sort of energy provider to China and weapons provider, at least in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, to Russia. And so it wasn't like totally surprising, I suppose, that the war in Ukraine and then the war in the Middle East actually broke out. And then last thing I'll say is that we have also come to the conclusion that the US is basically dangerously short of air defense missiles. And it can't possibly defeat militarily the combination of Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. Trump has admitted as much in comments on Air Force One. Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitted as much in sworn testimony before the US Congress. The Ukrainians have been complaining loudly about having insufficient air defense missiles. And the head of NATO, Rutte, has admitted that Russia alone produces 4 times as much weaponry as all of NATO combined. What does the combination of Russia and China do? Then throw in Iran and throw in North Korea. So when you have that as an axiom and the war in Iran breaks out, we were shocked. We had incorrectly assumed that Israel understood that such missiles were in short supply, and it is a small and vulnerable country. And when war broke out, we concluded quite quickly that it had to be a knockout blow, or else Israel could not win a war of attrition. And we said specifically, if there's missiles flying from Iran piercing Israeli air defense systems 3 or 4 days into this war is lost. And so coming to such conclusions allowed us to correctly call the oil market reaction, for example. We knew immediately when President Trump bragged on social media about the devastating strike that this had to be theater and that the war was over, that there was a ceasefire, there was some kind of deal cut, and the oil markets priced it perfectly. So last thing I would say is as far as pure sources of information go, global commodity markets are pretty strong input. The oil market never really priced in a full-blown war. There was certainly some geopolitical price premium baked into it, but the markets responded as though they knew this was going to end the way it did. So a bit of a long answer, but I wanted to sort of give you the holistic view before I talked about our current analysis.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. Firstly, this is certainly seen as an economic war, and we'll probably come on to this, right? The double-edged sword nature of tariffs and sanctions using the dollar as a weapon, and we've covered that significantly. There's question marks about whether there's an alternative currency. There probably isn't, but there might be some alternative technologies such as Bitcoin, and obviously there's very old things like gold. But is the US in particular sort of backing into a hot war? That's my sort of first question, is kind of, okay, that's the view from the global South, from sort of the BRICS, that this is on its way, it's happening. Is the West really understanding that viewpoint? And indeed, are we incrementally, by sort of perhaps a lack of strategy from a reactive nature of behaviors, backing into these, unconsciously into what could become a global hot war?
It is a global hot war. I think the thin veneer of deniability has long ago been pierced. I mean, Ukraine cannot launch long-range missiles into Russia without the active involvement of Western military officials and the active use of Western military intelligence and the active use of Western military satellites. Do you think, from the Russian perspective, that when a ATACMS missile is launched into what everybody would agree is traditional Russian territory, that isn't viewed as a hot war? It's American weapons, it's American generals. The New York Times had an amazing expose on just how involved U.S. generals were in the planning and execution of the various counterattacks and military strategy and target selection. I mean, just ask yourself a question. If China was doing this into the United States via Mexico, and of course, this would assume that the U.S. invades Mexico, and this is all in response to that invasion. There's no way that the U.S. would tolerate this, right? It would have long ago declared war on China. And so there's no backing into it. The U.S. and its Western allies are in an undeclared hot war with Russia. They just had an undeclared hot war with Iran, and they seem to be agitating for one with China.
Yeah. We just had Joe Bryan on, by the time this episode goes out, who was former Defense Department executive assistant over energy for the Navy, and there's a tail story here about supply chains and critical minerals and even energy itself, right? Lots of these bases around the world, US bases that project power, are tied to local grids, and there's an incredible sort of vulnerability there. There's a critical mineral story about sort of the yttrium and the all these products that go into creating these very sensitive lasers and etc. I guess that story we've told, and it's incredible how vulnerable those supply chains are. And as you say, Iran and Israel and the US were running out of missiles, right?
I'm not so sure that Iran was. And in fact, who do you think can supply faster, Russia and China supplying to Iran, or the US
Yeah,
supplying to Israel at the same time that it needs to send weapons to Ukraine?
yeah, and that comes back to the number of ships China is producing, every day versus the US Navy. But I guess for question one is this a slowly boiling the frog in growing intensity hot war? And what are sort of the second, third, fourth order impacts on energy? Because obviously, we've talked about this before. Energy, our food, all of this is a very global integrated system that works along Adam Smith lines, of specialization. I mean, that's already fraying at the edges. It's largely held together in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You can see that kind of in how food still flowed, oil still flowed. It shifted flows, but it didn't catastrophically stop them. How are we getting to points of severe vulnerability, and how far away are those from your analysis?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We've given a lot of thought to it, obviously, given the importance of energy in our writing, and we've been chronicling this for many years. At the moment, the market doesn't believe it. And we have several indicators that we have developed that might seem a little speculative as I described them, but in fact, we have seen that when true crisis arises, these things tend to signal to market observers that the crisis is real. One of them, for example, is the disparity in the price between West Texas Intermediate crude oil, WTI, and Brent crude oil. They trade largely in lockstep together, but they don't have to. Brent broadly can be considered sort of European oil, and WTI is considered sort of American produced oil. So imagine a world where Iran and Israel truly went for the knockout blows. Israel attacks Iranian oil export facilities. Iran attacks the limited number of power plants that keep the lights on and desalination plants that keep the water flowing in Israel. And it's a full-blown war. And there's questions in the market about whether Israel will use a nuke. And also, the critical strait in the Middle East is closed, it's mined, and 20-30% of the world's energy supply is choked off. The delta between WTI and Brent would blow wide open, because the first thing the US would do, of course, would be limit exports. That would crash the price of oil and products in North America and cause the price of oil and products in Europe to skyrocket. And so the world would be chasing a smaller, more limited supply with regional restrictions, and you would immediately see all of the net energy producers put walls up, limit exports, and the world is very different. And so throughout that crisis, we were watching the spread between those two grades, and they didn't move at all. That was one indication. Another indication is, and this is going to sound weird, we take the landed price of liquefied natural gas in Europe, and we multiply that price, which is quoted in dollars per million BTU, by 5.6. And we do that to get the energy equivalent price in barrels of oil, because there's 5.6 million BTUs in a barrel of oil. So if natural gas is trading for $10 a million BTU landed at the Dutch TTF contract, that's $56 a barrel of oil. Well, when you take Dutch TTF, multiply it by 5.6 and plot it against Brent, they too also trade in significant tandem, because in the end, there's enough fungibility of end use between, switchability between burning oil or burning natural gas, that they tend to trade in tandem during peacetime, during non-crisis episodes. So even though the price of natural gas and the price of oil was creeping up for geopolitical risk, neither of those two pair trades were signaling significant crisis. So again, this is just, as an analyst, you have a dashboard of indicators that you observe in real time. Markets are very efficient, and markets are decisively financial. Cutting through propaganda is what the collective wisdom of the world's traders get paid to do. There's a fascinating story in the Financial Times after the ceasefire was achieved between Iran and Israel about how the oil traders got it right and how they used a combination of open source intelligence, private satellite companies, and so on to understand what was really going on. And so, fascinating stuff.
Yeah. In fact, we've got a panel coming up in September about geopolitics overriding fundamentals in oil trading. Well, essentially, how 10 years ago, they didn't really have or didn't need significant sort of market intelligence operations. It was, or if they did, it was very much around how full the tanks are.
Yeah.
Not the tanks with wheels. And now it is the tanks with wheels, right? And building out those capabilities and giving a significant edge are tied to data science. Just on that sort of using commodities as a signal for war, because there are markets, or there's this sort of historical analysis, the Neil Ferguson sort of analysis that, prior to World War One, bonds weren't signaling, people expected a global conflagration. What's interesting is we just had a chap called Dennis Vosnesensky on, who's just written a book called War and Wheat, and he's an Australian grain analyst. He's gone back and looked at those markets in details and the physical operations. And actually you can see almost 9 months prior to the outbreak of war, Germany was stockpiling food, grain, and buying wheat at extraordinary amounts, and kind of the market missed it. What are we seeing in terms of stockpiling? We know that the Chinese have been buying some of the critical minerals that don't sit in their supply chain. They're relatively rare, but like rhenium is a good example. Are you using that in your analysis? Are people actually starting to think and prepare about stockpiles for war?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because there's always an alternative explanation, right? Now, I would say looking back at how markets have done historically may not be the best way to predict how markets will do today, because as you just described in framing the question, investors have become far more sophisticated in chasing such an edge, right? So the amount of data available to wealthy investors to decide such things presumably makes the ability to make such analyses easier. Not easy, but easier. To your question specifically, China has been the only commodity that we see that China is stockpiling at an unusual rate, at least for the markets we follow, is coal. They produce more than enough coal for their vast domestic needs. They burn 56% of the world's coal, and yet they still import a fair bit as well. And you could argue that this is a precaution that arose from the 2022 energy crisis that spread from Europe to the rest of the world and across all the primary energy commodity markets, because of course energy is quite fungible. So even though it was a natural gas crisis in Europe, the price of coal exploded worldwide. That significantly impacted China, and perhaps China said, never going to let that happen to us again. And so they are stockpiling a significant amount of coal, but there's very few things in their supply chain that they don't have what we have termed escalation dominance over President Trump. This is the one significant flaw.
Yeah, he doesn't have a big stick, right? Like, they can just shut the critical minerals off, and
he's a complex character. He's everything that everybody says he is, both his critics and his supporters.
Yeah.
And, we wrote a piece called WrestleMania. Donald Trump came of age during the 1980s when the U.S. was, a dominant power. And Mike Tyson was the heavyweight champion.
And the boogeyman was Japan, right? Like,
right.
You can look at 1982 New York, I would argue, is a really good, the feelings, the zeitgeist of that time is a really good descriptor of how he thinks about the world and just some of the actors that changed.
But it's 40 years on, and Mike Tyson ain't walking through that door, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the West has experienced a substantial amount of deindustrialization, and China has come out of nowhere. But the numbers are profound. We wrote a couple of pieces on this subject. China generates more than 2 times the amount of electricity that the U.S. does. It produces 7.5 times as much steel as the U.S. does. China's coal burning alone is 15% of all of the world's energy supply.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help navigate this change and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights, a global advisory network dedicated to the sector, providing senior advisors and subject matter experts to investment and infrastructure funds, law firms, and corporates. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections in energy and commodities to give clients the expertise they need when the stakes are high and insight matters. Learn more at encoinsights.com.
I mean, there's also the counter narrative, which is, a stated population of 1.4 billion. I don't want to go down sort of conspiracy theories here, but, going by sort of cell phone subscriptions and, there's plenty of incentives in that structure to be able to, for people to create fake IDs, to claim births, schools to claim students. And, by going down hard data of cell phone subscriptions and a couple of other tools, it might be more like 900 million. Like, you've got vast problems in China, and there's, that is a very talk about propaganda, a very curated propaganda that comes out of there. And it's, and so there's a counter, but I completely agree in terms of like the actual, hard control of some of these critical minerals that we have, the West has, utterly neglected. And, and despite great moves like MP Materials, it's going to take a long time. Let's just segue there to Taiwan though, because I think sort of that Israel-Iran hot war, that's sort of been game theoried. It feels like sort of the China invading Taiwan is still sort of in the realms of the unthinkable, but would have orders of magnitude bigger impacts, as you shut down the entire chip industry, obviously. Is that more or less likely than it was a year ago? What's the sort of the cascading effects on energy that you see there, and what signals are you looking at?
That's a great question. Actually, it dovetails on where I was heading with my prior answer, which is Trump always assumes that he has escalation dominance in any negotiation. And I think what he's finding, for example, with China, is that he in fact doesn't. Similarly, from a military perspective, with Russia, assuming that the U.S. is not willing to use nuclear weapons. Well, we wrote a piece called Escalation Dominance, and the social preview for that piece was Taiwan's energy vulnerabilities hand China the trump card in any conflict. And these are very simple things that you can do. You just take a look and see, okay, where does Taiwan get its energy? Well,
it shut down its nukes, and now it's LNG, right?
Well, it's LNG, and they get it from predominantly a couple of plants, and those plants are well within Chinese missile range. It's less than 200 miles from China, the major LNG import facility, and Russia demonstrated the Orezhnik missile, an event that has been vastly underreported in the Western media. For those that are unfamiliar, it's a cutting-edge hypersonic missile technology that Russia claims no air defense system in the world can stop. And one of the bad consequences of the war in Ukraine is that it is driving Russia and China ever closer together.
Yeah,
and
Russia's just handed all that over to China.
Right. And so if China has a version of the Orezhnik, in a matter of minutes, it could take out Taiwan's energy. And if you take out Taiwan's energy, Taiwan's not going to persist in its current form for very long. And in fact, they only have something like less than 2 weeks worth of natural gas storage on the island.
And you don't even need to fire the missile, to be clear. You can also just threaten it enough so that the shipping rates and insurance becomes prohibitively high, and the LNG stops flowing. Right? We had a Taiwan analyst on a year ago or so. She was just talking about obviously the energy, the politics, and the vulnerability over there. And you see that same sort of Germany narrative of shutting down nuclear power and reliant on wind. That wind just hasn't materialized in the capacity they thought it would, for whatever reason, politics, religiosity aside, if you'd like, and now fully reliant on LNG. But it's the ships themselves have to want to move there, and they're not going to want to risk missiles.
Yeah, look, I mean, a floating LNG carrier is a bomb. I mean, it's literally a giant ball of energy, well, multiple balls of energy, floating on the sea. And as you correctly said, you don't actually have to attack the import facility. That would do it. You could just say any LNG ship that comes through the strait is going to be boarded by the Chinese Navy. But like beyond that, almost all of their electricity comes from 2 power plants. Like you and I are discussing the prospect of the U.S. going to war with China right next door to China. Who has the longer supply chains? Right? It's crazy.
Well, and the nature of war has, again, Joe Bryan from the DoD talking about, we're in a new paradigm now as well, right? The US has invested heavily in capital assets that were the predominant power 20 years ago. This is the whole fighting the last war business. Whereas now, as proved by 30% of Russia's nuclear air force being taken out by, $100 drones, right? The world is changing. Are the consequences to global supply chains so catastrophic that is, almost preventative for this going ahead, or are we kind of, and again, I've sort of been doing a lot of World War I reading at the moment, it's kind of well-intentioned people weaving various commitments that march inevitably towards war, even though no one wanted it, right? I mean, is Taiwan so deleterious to society that it's almost unconscionable, or is that just not what's, I mean, what is the data saying?
Well, if we wanted to think laterally, China needs Taiwan's semiconductors as badly as the rest of the world does for now, and it has been spending tens of billions of dollars to gain domestic independence of that critical supply chain. And once it does, what does that mean for Taiwan? So when we read the talk of sanctions and Huawei achieving breakthrough chip performance and DeepSeek shows up out of nowhere and NVIDIA is now suddenly allowed to be selling H20 chips back into China, and China is loosening its rare earths export stuff. And then we see the MP materials news that you referred to that we wrote about this week. There are two ways to read that. That's both sides coming back from the brink and recognizing that it's in nobody's interest, or it's a temporary reprieve while both sides close their own vulnerabilities for the eventual attack. I don't know which of those two it is. I certainly hope it's the former. If you put me on a lie detector test, I would say that President Trump actually doesn't want war, but he has to deal with a wing of his support base, or at least the power brokers in Washington, D.C., who seem to always want to go to war, whether or not the U.S. wins them. And they just assume that there's an endless supply of weapons and soldiers and that the U.S. has escalation dominance in any conflict. And so you could sort of see Trump giving just enough to the neocons, as they're called, but not really pushing too far. So let's just take this 50-day quote-unquote ultimatum. One way to read that is Trump is giving Putin 50 days to finish his military objectives, and then they'll reach a ceasefire because, presumably Russia will occupy far more of the disputed regions, and the war could end quickly as long as the U.S. doesn't ramp up weapons too greatly. And then even this whole, we're going to give weapons to Ukraine, but Europe is going to pay for it. I've yet to see a European national country, like not the European Union, but like a European country, which presumably would have to foot this bill, come out and say, yeah, we're on the hook for our share of that $5, $6, $7 billion of new weapons that are supposed to be flowing to Ukraine. And so that whole major announcement that Trump had this past Monday could be viewed entirely differently than it is being reported, which is why I think it's important to have your fundamental axioms and then look through the news flow through those axioms. Like if our axiom is right, that the U.S. is in dangerously short supply of air defense missiles, and it is prioritizing, say, Israel over Ukraine, there's no amount of weapons the U.S. can give Ukraine that's going to make a difference in the war. So Trump is making these announcements to buy himself time and political maneuverability. Once the sort of one big beautiful bill passed, which is literally its name,
which I want to come on to, yeah,
we thought that maybe some of Trump's placating of that wing would abate because Lindsey Graham has a very prominent position in the financial governing of the country through his chairmanship in the U.S. Senate of the Finance Subcommittee, the Finance Committee, I should say. And so once that bill became law, which was the guts of Trump's domestic agenda, perhaps we thought he would be more free to, we would say, recognize reality. But it's to be determined at this point.
Yeah. Worthwhile reading Eisenhower's farewell speech regarding the long-standing neocons and all this kind of stuff. Just before I want to move on to the one big beautiful bill, and I want to talk about sort of the rapprochement trade as well, as I've sort of termed it. I think there's a couple of things stacking here. One is obviously the temptation of all of us to think the world is going to end in our times, right? And the more we see sort of global, we're all of us, I think, are discounting the impacts of COVID and that global trauma that happened that kind of has gone, I believe, as yet sort of unacknowledged, undealt with, and is sort of the root of some of this stuff. But there's that natural tendency to think that the world is going to end, that each generation has it and it has its Cassandras. I think then you layer in social media and the algorithm, the all important algorithm that just means that we are all flooded. Go on YouTube and Google kind of China population, and you'll be then flooded with lots of YouTube articles that are it's either 100 million people or it's 2 billion people, And for me as well, sort of listening to you and following your stuff, it is sort of that you're up against a welter out there of that kind of that religiosity approach, right? That sort of the propaganda as you describe it, right, where it's not facts and evidence based. And I guess my question to you is, if we were having this discussion back in 1986, there's lots of evidence that would point, you'd have the Afghan war, you'd have, what was going on in Lebanon, you'd have, Libya's about to nuke the UK, you'd have the Lockerbie crash. I mean, how different is today, do you think, versus, okay, the 90s were this anomaly, but the 1980s, the 1970s, just, philosophically, I guess, a challenge back to whether there's too much Doomberging, you know what I mean?
It was always meant to be a bit of an ironic name, just for the record, because we're actually usually quite optimistic people. It is, in fact, chosen to describe that very phenomenon, which is sort of our ideal client tends to be, our ideal customer tends to be relatively successful and willing to pay a premium price for a good product. And when people achieve a certain amount of wealth, they spend a lot of time what we call doom scrolling, looking for risks that they might lose it in order to sort of insulate themselves against those risks. And that's kind of fits the way we think as well. And so to your question, I think the big difference is today, the US is the declining superpower and China is the rising one. So the communist system fell for a variety of reasons. The answer to that question is of course, significant relevance. China has certainly studied it quite thoroughly. And the US today is just undeniably a power in decline. As you say, the US is armed with the weapons of 2 wars ago. And one wonders what would happen if an Orezhnik was fired at an aircraft carrier. The US doesn't have that many aircraft carriers, actually.
Well, they're 11 or whatever it is. I mean,
but they generally only operate 4 or 5 at a time, right? And those 11 are of varying ages, varying levels of maintenance. Talk about Googling around and finding interesting videos. Google around about the current state of the U.S. aircraft battle fleet.
But convincingly, China might have a navy that's completely made up of paper mache, right? Given the levels of corruption. Because there is one alternative narrative that strikes me is that the stakes are very high. You have, let's take Russia, China, and the US as key players. They each have really challenging circumstances at the moment. I'd say the US is by far the strongest, of course, but it's still very polarized. You've still got a lot of debt out there. You've still got, there's a lot of high inflation. There's a lot of challenges, and you've got coming AI, all this kind of stuff. Russia seems, is in dire straits, and China, under the surface would seem to be really struggling too. And it would seem to me, you've got, relatively speaking, very old and relatively unpopular leaders and very unpopular polities in each of those countries. You could see a scenario whereby actually by the end of this year, in the next 3-4 years or so, you could see, we've already had one attempted coup, a serious one in Russia. You could see a scenario where actually that entire generation of politicians sort of shuffle off. I don't know how you get structural reform in the US over term limits or, whatever, age restrictions and cognitive tests and stuff. And I'm not talking apolitically there. I think both sides have gerontologies, or what was the phrase? Geriarchies, I guess, would be the thing. I'm just sort of saying, there seems to be a lot out there when you really dig into kind of the actual status of the people. And especially in the authoritarian regimes of China and Russia, they are, reliant on their ability to coerce and stop these information flows and people realizing how bad it is. It just seems to me like there's also ripe for it to go in the other way, and we might actually, there's a significant argument that things could settle down and we could have significant change over the next couple of years.
I question some of your assumptions, especially about Russia and China, but
Fair.
I would say it's never wise to assume weakness on the part of your adversaries. And it's prudent to assume, especially given the social surveillance that China has installed, for example, that the Chinese Communist Party is here to stay, whether it's Xi Jinping or some palace coup happens. Similar story in Russia. I think one of the things that we have been warning about since the beginning of the war in Ukraine is this sort of Western techno-arrogance. that everything about the West is great and these totalitarian dictators don't know how to do anything. It's just wrong. Having come from the industrial side of things, right? Don't forget, like I used to go to China a lot. I observed firsthand how China monopolized key supply chains. You go look at BYD and compare them to any Western automaker. Those Western automakers who are capitalized for global growth they're finished. I mean, they can't compete. I think it's very unwise to underestimate what's going on in the real world. So, for example, some famous commentator, YouTube personality that I won't name, but I enjoy some of his work, was saying that Russian oil and gas production would stop once the Western firms pulled out. It's just nonsense. Like you have no idea what you're talking about. I've interacted with international oil and gas companies. If you don't think that China, India, and Russia can't keep Russian oil and gas flowing because Schlumberger pulled out, you just have no idea what you're talking about. And so how can Russia be on the cusp of economic collapse and outproducing NATO by a factor of 4? These are NATO's numbers, not Russian numbers. Like, I just think it's a dangerous assumption. I think you have to assume strength.
Yeah.
And then prepare yourself accordingly. And the thing that we object to, if you want to talk about corruption and unpopular leaders, what's the congressional approval rate right now?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're trying to tell me that
some of them came in as sort of, hostesses and so on, and end up being worth 40 million. But
look, Nancy Pelosi and by the way, it's a bipartisan thing. I mean, Mitch McConnell can barely stand up. Right? These people never leave. Donald Trump is, he's popular amongst his base, but Hillary Clinton is still thinking about running for president.
Yeah.
Right. And then you want to talk about corruption. How can the U.S. spend $900 billion on its military and be vastly outproduced by the gas station masquerading as a country, as Russia is often portrayed as? That's just nonsense. Of course there's corruption in Russia. Of course there's corruption here. There's massive corruption here. Look at the healthcare system in the United States.
Yeah, largest employer in the United States these days.
Yeah, but try to get actually healthy, spending money in that system.
Yeah.
So I understand that that's how those other countries are portrayed. Having been there, having competed against them, having interacted with them over the decades, I just think that's dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say is I've always sort of felt that, through the course of this podcast, that the global commodity markets are this force for good, right? They are the one thing that is binding and lubricating international relations. And I find this sort of balkanization of markets and increasing government intervention within them as a response to national security, right? Economics dictates we will shut down this, nickel mine or whatever it might be, rare earth processing center. But, the only way the private sector is going to keep it open is government intervention. And then suddenly we've got far less efficient markets. We have less global markets. And, again, it points to the kind of the ability at which fractious interactions can suddenly become hot wars because there's no longer that glue that was the global energy and commodity markets.
Yeah. So we've been writing about this for a while and giving a lot of thought to this. And 2 years ago now, we coined a phrase called geopolitical warfare.
Yeah.
And basically, the main way in which China came to dominate these critical supply chains.
Yeah, we talked about it on our last episode. Yeah, accepting the pollution, right?
Right. The convergence of their geopolitical aims and their environmental stewardship produced this outcome, and that is a policy choice. So, if you want to counter that, which is what we wrote about with MP Materials, and the piece was called "How It's Done." Obviously, we were supportive of that transaction. Is you either loosen your own environmental controls, which you don't want to do, or you have to subsidize. And the ways in which one subsidizes can be intelligent or stupid.
It definitely took Washington, at least my sort of connections, by surprise how the nature of that deal, right? And sort of quite forward thinking and also relatively kept under wraps as well, versus pricing support and all the rest of it.
Sure. For those that just see the Trump administration as Orange Man bad, might not realize that he has filled his administration with very savvy, very successful business people, starting with his Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, who is a founder of several energy unicorns and a very shrewd person and who understands the energy markets. Littered throughout the Trump administration are people that understand business, understand the capital markets, and understand how to unstick things.
Although they did doge some of the underlying experts that we've been building up.
I think
Department of Energy and stuff.
I think your definition of expert and my definition of business expert are probably different.
Yeah, no, I agree the distinction between the two, but
Yeah.
we
And
had
if you
we had a
look at
form
the
of
way this, sure. I mean, but I would say the Doge stuff has been wildly exaggerated, much to our disappointment. We were hopeful that much of the waste and fraud that so transparently exists in the U.S. government would finally be rooted out. It doesn't look like much is going to come of it. I suppose one
Yeah.
shouldn't be too surprised, given that it was Elon Musk in charge of it. But
Yeah.
that deal with MP Materials was structured brilliantly.
Hello, I'm David Hunt, founder and managing director at Hyperion Search. Founded over a decade ago, Hyperion Search has helped organizations from major utilities to startups recruit their leadership teams and key individual contributors to accelerate both their growth and the energy transition. Our three main verticals are renewable power, energy storage, and e-mobility. The energy transition and the talent that delivers it has been our passion since day one. To find out more, visit hyperionsearch.com or listen to my Leaders in Cleantech podcast, available on all platforms.
Well, to that point, I mean, I think there are areas like we had Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes on, who was in Department of Energy and over critical minerals, who herself has created, some metals unicorns in her history, saying actually there was some gutting of people just deciding to leave, right? Because there's a very competitive labour market out there for these types of experts.
Sure.
Saying all that, obviously we've just had the one big, beautiful bill, which, seems wildly unpopular when people actually start reading into it, as it pertains to energy transition, critical minerals. There's a lot in there. Obviously, the headline feature being kind of wind farms lose, and things like coal, but also some of the critical minerals continue to get support. What takeaways do you have from that? Do you think net it's positive? Do you think that or negative, it might set us back in the energy transition? Bits of the IRA that were gutted. I mean, what's sort of your analysis of that, or is it still too big to read it all?
No, I think there's sort of the immediate analysis, and then there's sort of a second and third order impact that we can discuss. The immediate analysis is it's a gut punch to solar and wind and batteries, and it is a windfall for the production of traditional hydrocarbons. Whether or not companies take advantage of that remains to be seen, because at the same time that Trump wants more energy, that necessarily means he wants lower priced energy, and producers of energy are not necessarily huge fans of that. We like to say that energy companies get to build stuff during Republican administrations and they get to make money during Democratic administrations, because then all of a sudden, the restrictions go back up. And
this is the internal conflict in energy dominance, right?
Yes,
you can be energy dominance, but you can't incentivize new growth, and you can't be rich.
Yes, if you flood the world with cheap energy, the price of energy goes down.
But where does that going back to your BYD piece, right?
Yeah.
I mean, is this okay? It's great for sort of the lunches and diners at Mar-a-Lago, and obviously lots of my friends and neighbors in Houston. But where, in 10 years' time, will this be seen as America truly the pivot moment when America yielded the future economy?
I don't think that solar and wind are the future of anything.
But I mean, okay, sorry, so to be clear.
Yeah.
I think
electric vehicles and batteries.
The electrification, the increasing and ongoing and unstoppable electrification of the world, right? Through batteries, AI, it's all going electric at some point. Whatever the fuel is to make that electricity, yielding the ability, the capacity, and to make chips, to build that infrastructure of the future. I guess it's a question. I don't, what are keen on your thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't think the big beautiful bill changes much of that. Look, the U.S. has huge structural advantages. By the way, the biggest loser in all of this is Europe, which we should get to. But before I answer this question, I want to go back and finish my thought on like the second order effect, which is this whiplash phenomenon that we've been warning about. Like, whatever your views of wind and solar, and we happen to be deeply bearish them, it is patently unfair to the wind industry what happened to them, right? You go from, please build out 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030.
Yeah, there are no European oil companies coming over here and spending $6 billion, again for a very long time, right? That uncertainty around policy is
correct.
It means the US is now somewhat viewed as a Latin American country when it comes 100%. To political risk, right?
We wrote a piece called Whiplash, on this effect. Like, what happens if Trump becomes unpopular? Maybe the Epstein stuff brings him down. Who knows? And the Democrats regain power. Gavin Newsom is president in 2028. All that going to be reversed? And so the problem is the capital planning cycle of heavy industry is longer than the political cycle of the U.S.
Yeah, duration mismatch, right? 10 years versus 2.
Correct. And I wanted to get that point across before we pivot to your next question. Please remind me what it was.
Well, it's just sort of like, if we're looking in the long view here,
Oh,
and
yes, the
irrespective
pivot,
of your
yeah.
fuels for the electrification, and we've obviously in the past we've had lots of discussions around the nature of wind and solar and their energetic returns, and and it sort of sets the internet on, or the listener base on fire. But my sort of concern, if you look on the long view, is actually, again, coming back to my discussion with Joe Bryan of the DoD, like they recognise that the future wars are going to be. It's much better to have batteries than to try and pipe fuel up to the front line, right? The future is going to be electrified. And is the US in some way yielding its technological, okay, they're certainly not at a par with China in some of these areas, but are they yielding even more that space and ground to the global East?
I think this bill is an attempt to regain some of it because it is going to incentivize the reshoring of critical supply chains and equipment.
Mm.
And the US has a huge world-beating energy advantage, which is its endless supply of dirt cheap natural gas, a very clean burning fuel. The issue is, of course, turbines are in short supply,
Yeah.
right? And perhaps making some of those domestically and other
The yttrium that goes into them to make
sure,
them
all of those
all
things,
made in
right?
China.
But this is the grand vision of Trump, whether or not it's achievable in the political time horizon that he is hoping it is to bring those things back and plug them into natural gas. I mean, the US produces so much natural gas so cheaply that it is a huge, huge tailwind to reindustrialization.
Yeah.
And even with AI, you could build all this stuff off grid, which we've predicted. And so, basically, China's doing all this burning coal.
Yeah.
Right.
And China's and Europe's got none, right? I mean,
Europe's got none. We could talk about Europe, and I will in a second, but China has an enormous amount of coal and burns it. The US is predominantly going to burn natural gas. Which fuel would you rather have? I would pick natural gas. It's cleaner, easy to burn, produces high quality heat, steam, all the things you need. But let's just talk about Europe. I want to quantify this for your listeners. Europe consumes roughly 40 exajoules of hydrocarbons each year. So energy derived from natural gas, coal, and oil. It consumes 40 exajoules. It only produces 6. So it has to import. This is the 27 member states of the European Union, which of course excludes Norway and the United Kingdom. But the 27 member states themselves produce 6 out of their 40 exajoules of hydrocarbons. So they have to import the other 34. That's roughly the entire size of the US natural gas production, which I believe is like 37 exajoules. And so when you import primary energy, every entity in the supply chain, from the exploration to the drilling to the midstreamers to the export terminal to the import terminal, every entity that touches that energy has to earn their cost of capital. And it's just a structural disadvantage for Europe. Never mind security of supply in a world where things bifurcate because there's a hot war between Iran and Israel that goes straight to the mattresses. They're just structurally impaired irreversibly. They have lots of wind and solar. Good luck to you. And so the U.S. has huge advantages. What would hold it back would be another forever war before they're ready.
Is there not so there is, the counter narrative to this is actually you've had 10, 20 years of Europe spending a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money to develop precisely what you need, which is a robust domestic energy production capability through renewables, right? Backed by some nukes, by some offshore oil and gas, coupled with lots of, and I know obviously the Spain story, but soon to be coupled with lots of storage that actually, and this is the Jeff Curry argument, suddenly in the energy transition world, you go from a high capex to an incredibly low, almost zero opex, right? A zero cost of power. And whoever wins that race suddenly has an incredible advantage, even over the US's natural gas advantage. So there's a story there about Europe as it builds up this capability, suddenly is no longer reliant on foreign hydrocarbons that they had to pay an extraordinary amount for. They have domestic energy production, and but coupled now with a zero power cost, if you'd like, and suddenly they are.
Yeah.
I hear you chuckling, but
I want to say this as politely as I can, but that is utter fantasy. There is a great sleight of hand that goes on when people make this argument. which is that the marginal cost of the fuel is the marginal cost of using the fuel. And they're two wildly different things. There is no example in the world of a meaningfully sized grid that runs just on solar, wind, and batteries. And almost everywhere that we can find where solar and wind gain meaningful market share above a certain threshold, the price of electricity skyrockets. If it were not so, California and Germany would be energy superpowers. They're flaccid energy vassals now. Industry can't operate there. This is why Germany is deindustrializing. This is why Britain is deindustrializing. The marginal cost of fuel is different than the marginal cost of using the fuel. Not so with hydrocarbons. And so in a world where Europe doesn't make its own hydrocarbons, and by the way, you can't really electrify.
So the marginal cost of using the fuel, that is all of the grid management, the energy storage, the smart meters.
Intermittency, all of the challenges that come with. Look, I mean,
but is that not temporary? Like, and actually, you get to sort of is there no robust state future where actually?
No. Well, let's build one. I would love to see a pilot project. And credit where credit is due. This concept was first crossed my desk in a blog called the Manhattan Contrarian. In the industrial world, before you build a world scale new facility for the first time,
you hook a village up with it and see what
you pilot. Yeah. Okay. Let's build a city from scratch. 10,000 people, and only allow them to have wind, solar, and batteries. By the way, electricity is a small part of the global energy footprint. And in an electrify everything world, you're talking about electrifying heat, in the winter. It just doesn't, how's that going to compete with a cogeneration facility running on natural gas? It is the stuff of spreadsheet dwellers. There's no other way to say it. People who have no real world experience.
Flaccid energy vassals.
And spreadsheet dwellers. Yeah. I mean, let's build it. Let's do it. Let's get a community and see what it costs. And by the way, here's the other thing about the grid. It doesn't take much in the way of reliability loss for a grid to become terribly inefficient to run an economy. The operation of a modern grid is a symphony of expertise that everybody takes for granted. And then the last thing I would say is that everyone assumes that electricity is electricity, but it's not. There's quality of electricity along with reliability of electricity, the inertia of the electricity producing sources and their ability to ride out the chaotic nonlinearities, so that butterflies don't take down the whole grid of Spain. These are real world things that operators of grids have been warning about. Look, there's a lot of happy talk about renewables and the fuel is free. It's just utter nonsense. I don't know.
Yeah, and maybe I've the sort of the statement that was made is nukes or maybe hydro, but nukes plus renewables, right? So I think that's probably some of the nuance there.
Well, there's a challenge that France is also demonstrating that nuclear plants aren't exactly great at demand matching. Like they're great at staying on at the exact same power level and having the rest of the grid fill in the gap. But France's efforts to toggle nuclear energy production is doing significant damage to that fleet of nuclear reactors. So there's no free lunch, right?
No.
And so back to the sort of the meta question about Europe, 300 million people, we haven't even demonstrated the concept. I would love to see a demonstrated concept of a nuke plant and just renewables and see how that goes. It's amazing that the world is completely overhauling one of the most valuable and important infrastructure assets at the very foundation of the global economy without even running a pilot.
Yeah. And as you say as well, one of the challenges about all of this is that it's very easy to stray into belief rather than analysis, right? And there's a lot of belief out there, and the arguments that you hear are tending towards kind of what we see in politics, right? Which is a belief structure rather than kind
Correct.
of what is the actual analysis telling us about whether we should raise the debt $5 trillion or whatever it is, right?
I can guarantee you that people listening to this who are pro renewables are going to shut down and just assume that Doomberg is a fossil fuel industry puppet, right? That's what they're going to assume. And that's when you are confronted with information that is inconsistent with the sea of propaganda you're swimming in. But again, just California, most expensive electricity in the country, highest penetration of renewables. Let's just talk about one phenomenon. the sun either shines or it doesn't. And the more solar you have on your grid, the greater the variance that grid has to handle between when it's dark and when the sun is hot. And by the way, when the sun is hot, all solar panels are making electricity all at once, and electricity prices, spot electricity prices, often go negative. That is not a sign of a healthy grid. That is a sign of a grid in serious danger. And even hydro is intermittent when you measure decades.
Yeah.
And so you could never really.
And perhaps we don't want to build more dams because obviously we've tilted the earth by 3 feet, and that might.
And by the way, they sometimes collapse.
Yeah, well, I mean, talk about sort of tail risk. The Three Gorges Dam,
Oh well, I mean, a major dam collapsed in China. The name escapes me in the 1970s, and it's estimated that between 50,000 and 250,000 people died.
Yeah, and again, but that points to if there was a hot war. I mean, you just look at the anyway.
Of course, look. The bridges over the Dnieper in Ukraine, the Dnieper River. There's I think 17 major bridges, and I think at least 6 of them are really just dams with roads on top of them. So imagine a world where Russia decides it wants to take on all those
and they
bridges.
did do 1 or 2, right?
Right. Yeah. Look, it happens. So the point is, we didn't go around the world and dismantle all of the hydro plants after that dam in China collapsed, but look at the world's reaction to Fukushima, where 1 person is known to have died. The disparity in risk tolerance and the ability to appraise risk is another big challenge to having a smart energy policy.
Which brings me to my final question. Let's call it the Doomberg quotient, right? Sort of on whatever scale you want to do, and perhaps it's logarithmic. Like, where is your sort of global risk quotient at the moment? Like, how risky a place are we compared to, let's say compared to this time last year? And is that outside of people who are extraordinarily wealthy, and often they're thinking about building bunkers because they're now at a point where they definitely want to keep what they've earned, and they have enough money to be able to do this kind of analysis and affect change around it. Is that risk? It just seems to me that a 5% interest rate on the 10-year Treasury doesn't price in the risk of all of this stuff we've just spoken about.
Yeah. In a way, I think it all depends on whether the ceasefire between Iran and Israel holds. The impact of what occurred during those 12 days within Iran itself is being misreported in the West. And whether Trump truly internalizes and recognizes that the U.S. needs a lot more time.
That impact being basically negligible, right?
The impact in Iranian society of unifying them around a regime that everyone in the West assumes is
the minute the Israelis started attacking civilian infrastructure,
correct,
changed that narrative, as I understand it, within Iran from
decapitation strikes are like tariffs; they really work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they end up having the opposite effect. The thing that amazes me, similarly with renewables, is like when all the evidence points to something not working, the proponents just say that's proof of the need to do more. Like sanctions don't work. I don't know what Trump is doing, threatening more sanctions on Russia. If sanctions on Russia would have worked, the war would have been over by now.
Yeah.
They don't work. They always backfire. And in fact, the weaponization of the dollar, to your point, I mean, the thing that puzzles us about the 10-year yield is more the impact of the weaponization of the dollar and the displacement of treasuries as neutral reserve assets by gold. The price of gold is really an indicator. Look, U.S.
we had
treasuries.
Stephanie Baker on talking about precisely the Russian sanctions and just how inconclusive that book is. Her book about like the impacts, right? You're still having, Sergei Lavrov buying incredible apartments in Dubai.
The rest of the world. This is the interesting thing, and I was going to say this about markets. Like the rest of the world, insider trades, right? That's why global markets, global commodity markets, can be pretty telling because they don't have the securities laws. And the U.S. is quickly losing its own securities enforcement. And so, yeah, like the rest of the world is corrupt openly. Like, yes, that's how the pieces lie on the chessboard. Now do some analysis. Sanctions don't work. The sanctions against China are making China create its own semiconductor supply chain much quicker than they would have otherwise, which is something we've been arguing for a very long time. The best way for the West to insulate itself from geopolitical risk is to strengthen itself, not weaken its enemies. You have to strengthen yourself. And so looking inward, developing industry.
Yeah, this is quietly building up a supply chain around critical minerals before you go and trigger a trade war.
Right.
Yeah,
And then suddenly you have to back down because all of your auto factories are going to close because they can't get critical minerals because China, through pollution, lack of pollution controls.
But again, it comes back to duration mismatch, right? You've got China that has the long-term strategy capability, and the West, which has got ever more volatile politics on a 2 or 4 year cycle.
And also
not that I
polar.
not that I want the alternative, but
Sure.
a little bit more centrist and less polarization. And again, it all comes back to where everyone is in their own single algorithm, and it's not conducive to people don't. And again, part of the effort of this podcast, right, is to try and sit in the middle and understand, and not as opposed to run off down a particular belief structure that is unassailable.
Yeah, I mean, I just think this is the challenge of the day for analysts, and this is why the opening answer to your first question was setting that framework for how we like to think. And look, we get stuff wrong. You get stuff wrong. It's how you handle when you get stuff wrong that matters. But the propaganda is just so thick right now. And at the same time, just look at the ability to track the front lines in Ukraine. There's never been more open source, accurate information available to those willing to go find it. And so, but to your, the broader question, 5% yield, puzzle to us too. But
yeah,
that's where we are.
Buy gold, build bunkers. But anyway, well, Doomberg, I always enjoy our conversations. I find them enlightening, challenging, and a tonic for sort of testing my own assumptions, and I'm sure our listeners do too. I find your Substack always great, interesting, and challenging read, even if it's sometimes, as you say, feels slightly concerning and worrying. They can find you at doomberg.com, right, and subscribe to your Substack there.
Yeah, everything's there. We have our newsletter, which we write about 90 articles a year, roughly one every 4 days. We also have a pro tier where we do a deep dive monthly webinar or monthly recorded presentation that we send out to that tier. This month, we're doing one on the great game that is the Arctic Circle. Last month, we did one on gold. And then all of our podcast appearances are there, like this one. So, it's been really fantastic to talk with you. I really enjoy our conversations, I should say, authentically, because we do challenge each other in polite ways. I'm always open for polite discourse that is expressed authentically, and you certainly have a forum where that is enabled. So congrats to you, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Well, yeah, I look forward to having you back on in a year, and hopefully the Doomberg quotient has dipped a little.
We are anti-war, pro-peace for sure.
Good man. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks to you and your team. Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.